and they will lose legitimacy, but they would see this through the just war prism of jus ad bellum, that they still had 1,200 people who were killed, and that they need to make a strategic difference to make sure this doesn't happen for the next 50 years.
A vote at the United Nations Security Council on a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza has been delayed again. It was due to be happening now, but has been postponed until tomorrow while negotiations on the text continue. The United States has vetoed previous resolutions on the issue, and there have been reports that the latest draft refers to a suspension of hostilities. This was the White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby speaking a short time ago.
44 signatories on this joint statement. Several nations now willing to join us publicly in this, and others that are willing to participate in this maritime coalition. It's hard to look at these things which the United States has driven forward, and say that we're somehow isolated on the world stage. In fact, I think what this shows is our convening power and how much American leadership matters on the world stage.
Well, aid agencies have voiced their concerns at the plight of civilians in Gaza. The UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, said a sustainable ceasefire was needed on both human rights and humanitarian grounds. But Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has said that Israeli military ground operations will expand to additional areas in the Gaza Strip. Here, the Prime Minister was asked what the UK is doing to reduce the scale of civilian casualties in the war. The chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Alicia Cairns, pressed Rishi Sunak on the issue during his appearance before the Commons Liaison Committee. Major General Chip Chapman is a former head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence and a former senior British military advisor to the US Central Command. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Carol.
Really good to have you with us. We'll talk a bit more about the British position in a moment. But first of all, what's your understanding of what's happening at the UN Security Council? This vote was due to take place yesterday. It was due to take place tonight. It seems as though the negotiations are now continuing.
Well, wording is always important, these things. And the spectrum that we talk about is from the left of a truce, which has a meaning in international law in the way that ceasefire doesn't. The third part would be an armistice, and the real panacea is getting to a peace settlement. And you saw that, for example, in both the First World War was an armistice leading to a peace settlement, and the Korean War was an armistice which didn't lead to a peace settlement. So the wording of what you put in terms of what is either a suspension or sustainable can have meaning in terms of the sub-paragraphs and what they mean for that. A ceasefire should really be a pause with a purpose. It's what that purpose should be from both sides, really, because as someone who's a human, of course you should welcome humanitarian aid, but from the other side, Israel still has its military objectives, and they haven't achieved them yet. So I don't see them stopping until they've achieved something like their military objectives. But the problem with that, of course, is that the object of war should always be a better peace. It's difficult to see what that better peace is in terms of the politics of the thing, because all wars are fought for political objectives, not just for military operations.
And it's clear that the United States is maintaining its support for Israel whilst urging restraint. It has vetoed previous UN resolutions. Are we heading towards some kind of resolution that calls for something like a suspension of hostilities, which is quite likely to be ignored on the ground in any case and doesn't really make a huge difference?
Well, it depends again what that pause with purpose is. If it is some sort of reciprocity in terms of the hostages being released, in terms for humanitarian relief and sustained humanitarian relief, then that would be, I think, welcomed by the Israelis, because that is one of their key objectives, and of course is in tension with one of their other objectives, which is obviously to dismantle Hamas and Hamas's military capability. Now, if you look at the operational concept of victory, the Israeli 2020 paper, they described the Hamas as a rocket-based terror army. There were rockets fired again tonight into Israel on day 74, so they haven't achieved that yet. They still need to achieve that. So just having a pause for the Israelis without something which they can bank is not going to work, I think.
There is, though, isn't there, growing pressure for something to be done to reduce the scale of the civilian casualties, as week after week we see more and more innocent civilians in Gaza being killed or maimed as this war continues. And the Israeli defense minister is making it clear that Israel intends to actually expand its ground operation. We heard Rishi Sunak under pressure there. We've now got 10 Conservative MPs joining the calls for an immediate ceasefire. Do you think that as this continues, there is going to be increasing pressure, which may make it very difficult for Israel to maintain the international support that it's had, at least in places like the US and the UK until now?
Of course, I think that's going to be the case, but we have to be really careful, I think, of one of the sort of two of the seven deadly biases of analysis, which are framing bias and being and confirmation bias. Now we're looking at this through Western prism, and Israel doesn't look at it in that way. So what we would deem to be proportionate, necessary, and distinction in terms of civilian casualties is not necessarily the way that the Israelis look at it. So their real, the way they look at it would be, how do you weigh the lives of civilians against their military gains? Now that's not an ethical position, it's not a moral position, but it's the way that the Israelis look at it. Now we could say that is wrong. I would say it's wrong, and particularly in terms of the incidents of shooting the hostages who were trying to come out and go into Israeli hands. But they don't look at things the same way as us, and we can condemn it as much as we like, and I think we will continue to do this. And they will lose legitimacy, but they would see this through the just war prism of jus ad bellum, that they still had 1,200 people who were killed, and that they need to make a strategic difference to make sure this doesn't happen for the next 50 years, which is why I think, it's back to Netanyahu's words initially, that this is not another round. It is not another operation. This is a war. And this is why, if you look at the fact that we're at day 74, when these Israeli operations previously were 11 days, 18 days, and 19 days, it is different. And
Yes.
that also, of course, has a real big difference in terms of the flare-ups in the West, the polarization which happens in our own societies, and all those things which could elevate the threat level in the UK as it has for 5 countries in Europe, for example.
Major General Chip Chapman, really good to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Karen.